border is silent, snow absorbs sound, watchtowers stand still under a pale northern sky. Somewhere in Lapland, boots cut through ice as soldiers move without speaking, rehearsing a war no one officially wants, but everyone is preparing for. This is not Ukraine. This is not the Middle East. This is Northern Europe, where a border that once symbolized calm coexistence is hardening into one of the most dangerous fault lines on the planet. For decades, Finland was known as the exception, a country that survived history by balancing carefully between East and West. That era is over. As winter drills unfold less than 70 kilometers from Russian territory, Helsinki is signaling something unmistakable. Neutrality has been replaced by readiness. The scale is unprecedented. The message is blunt. For Moscow, this shift is not abstract, it triggers memory. In Russian strategic thinking, geography is inseparable from trauma. The forests, lakes, and narrow corridors of the north are not empty spaces, they are invasion routes remembered in blood. In 1939, the Soviet Union crossed this same frontier convinced that Leningrad was vulnerable. The war that followed shattered assumptions on both sides. Today, the names have changed, but the reflex has not. The Kremlin's language has returned to familiar phrases. Threats balance protection of the people. Under Vladimir Putin, the logic of siege dominates Russian security culture. Borders are not lines, they are buffers. When those buffers disappear, panic sets in. Finland's military awakening collapses one of the last illusions Moscow held, that the North would remain quiet while attention stayed fixed on Ukraine. This is why the reaction has been immediate and physical. Concrete, trenches, revived bases. Along the 1 to 300 kilometer frontier, Russia is transforming what was once Europe's calmest border into a fortified zone. It is not preparation for dialogue, it is preparation for containment. The language of walls has replaced the language of diplomacy. Yet this is not simply a military story, it is a political one and a deeply human one. As generals redraw maps, civilians find themselves trapped between strategy and history. Nowhere is this more visible than in Karelia, the Russian region pressed directly against Finland. Once a gateway to Europe, it is becoming a cul-de-sac of sanctions, closures, and suspicion. While headlines focus on tanks and jets, something quieter is unfolding. Trade routes have collapsed. Families are separated. A border that people crossed for shopping, work, and school now cuts through lives with surgical precision. The same security logic that reassures capitals is suffocating communities. From Washington to Brussels, the northern shift is framed as deterrence. Under President Donald Trump, the United States emphasizes strength alliances and strategic credibility. Finland's move is welcomed as proof that NATO's perimeter is solidifying. But deterrence always carries a price, and it is rarely paid by those who design it. As snow continues to fall across Lapland, the question is no longer whether the North will remain peaceful. That question has already been answered. The real question is deeper and more unsettling. When security hardens into permanence, what happens to the people caught inside the walls? Finland's transformation did not happen quietly, but it happened fast. In Helsinki, the language of caution has been replaced by the language of survival. What is unfolding is not a temporary mobilization or a symbolic gesture. It is a national redesign of defense built on the assumption that the unthinkable must now be planned for in detail. At the center of this shift is a concept Finland calls total defense. It is not merely about soldiers, it is about society. Industry infrastructure, civil administration, and even demographics are being folded into a single security framework. For a country of just 5.5 million people, the goal is staggering: the ability to mobilize 1 million personnel in a crisis. This is not a standing army in the traditional sense, but a layered force drawn from reserves, civil defense units, logistics networks, and territorial forces trained to operate independently if command structures are disrupted. The symbolism matters. In modern Europe, mass mobilization belongs to history books, not policy documents. Finland is deliberately breaking that taboo. Laws have been amended to extend reserve obligations. Training cycles have intensified. Shelters long maintained quietly beneath cities are being inspected and modernized. The message to the population is unambiguous: this is everyone's responsibility. Weapons reinforce that message. Finland's acquisition of F-35A stealth fighters marks a qualitative leap, not just an upgrade. These aircraft are designed for information dominance, seeing deep, striking first, surviving contested airspace. Positioned in the north, they extend NATO's sensor reach toward Russia's most sensitive regions. From Moscow's perspective, this is not defense in depth, it is surveillance at the doorstep. Exercises with allies have followed the same logic. Joint drills with British and NATO forces in harsh Arctic conditions are rehearsals for isolation, not expedition. They simulate cut supply lines, frozen terrain, and autonomous operations. Finland is not preparing to fight abroad. It is preparing to deny access to make any incursion slow, painful, and politically catastrophic for an attacker. This is where the strategic calculation becomes clear. Finland is betting that resilience deters escalation, that a society visibly prepared for prolonged resistance raises the cost of aggression beyond what any rational actor would accept. In Helsinki, this is framed as prudence. In Moscow, it is read as provocation. The psychological impact is impossible to separate from the military one. For decades, Finland's neutrality served as a buffer not only on maps, but in minds. Its disappearance amplifies Russian fears of encirclement. It also reassures NATO members who watched Ukraine's fate with growing unease. Security in this new northern reality is contagious. But there is a paradox at the heart of total defense. The more complete it becomes, the more it reshapes daily life. Readiness becomes normal. Emergency planning becomes routine. The boundary between civilian and soldier blurs. Finland accepts this trade-off consciously. Others may not have chosen it so willingly. As Europe's north locks itself into a posture of permanent alert, the question is no longer whether Finland can defend itself. The question is whether a continent built on openness can sustain this level of vigilance without losing something fundamental in the process. Moscow's response has been neither subtle nor restrained. Where Finland signals readiness through drills and laws, Russia answers with concrete steel and earthworks. Along the long northern frontier, construction crews now work where customs officers once waved travelers through. Barracks rise from frozen ground. Old Soviet-era bases are dragged back into service. What was a quiet periphery is being recast as a front line. This reaction exposes more than strength. It reveals anxiety. The Kremlin frames these measures as defensive, yet the scale suggests something deeper, a fear that strategic depth is collapsing. The North was supposed to be stable. Ukraine was supposed to be the problem. Instead, NATO has moved closer to one of Russia's most sensitive regions, compressing warning times and narrowing options. The revival of the Leningrad military district is central to this mindset. In Russian doctrine, districts are not administrative conveniences. They are warfighting constructs. Reorganizing forces in the northwest signals that planners in Moscow now treat Finland not as a neighbor, but as a potential axis of conflict. Fortifications stretching from Karelia toward the Arctic are designed to slow channel and absorb pressure. They are measures taken by a state that expects friction, not cooperation. High-level visits underscore the urgency. Statements from Russian security officials emphasize border reliability, sovereignty, and deterrence. Yet rhetoric cannot hide the contradiction. Russia invaded Ukraine to prevent NATO expansion. The result has been the opposite. Finland and Sweden joined the alliance, and NATO infrastructure now sits closer to St. Petersburg than at any point in modern history. This shift has forced Moscow into a reactive posture. Resources are diverted north at a time when they are desperately needed elsewhere. Manpower already strained by the war in Ukraine is being stretched thinner. The fortifications may look formidable, but they cannot solve the underlying problem. Russia is now defending more frontiers with fewer options and less flexibility. Inside Russia, this reality creates quiet tension. Official media portrays the northern buildup as proof of vigilance. Locally, the story is different. Communities see investment flowing into military sites while civilian infrastructure decays. Roads lead to bases, not markets. Security grows, but prosperity does not follow. Strategically, the Kremlin faces an uncomfortable truth. Walls can delay movement, but they cannot reverse alliances. Concrete cannot undo political choices made in Helsinki, Stockholm, or Brussels. Each bunker poured into the Karelian soil is an admission that influence has been lost and must be replaced with force. As Russia hardens its borders, it also hardens its worldview. Suspicion becomes policy. Isolation becomes normal. The question looming over this militarized landscape is not whether the fortifications will hold, but whether a state that increasingly builds inward can still project confidence outward. In Karelia, the consequences of this new border are not theoretical. They are visible in empty parking lots, shuttered hotels, and warehouses filled with unsold timber. This region pressed between Russia and Finland was never meant to be a military buffer. It was a bridge. For decades, Karelia functioned as a living corridor between Russia and Europe, bound by trade culture and family ties that ignored political lines. That bridge has collapsed. When Finland closed its border crossings, the economic shock was immediate and severe. Trade that once flowed daily simply stopped. Timber exports, the backbone of the regional economy, lost their primary market overnight. Redirecting goods eastward proved futile. Transport costs erased profits. What remained was stagnation measured not in percentages, but in livelihoods lost each day. Small towns felt it first. Cafes that once served Finnish tourists now sit dark. Taxi drivers wait for passengers who never arrive. Markets that thrived on weekend traffic have fallen silent. This is not the impact of a battlefield, it is the impact of a line drawn and sealed. The irony is sharp measures taken in the name of security have dismantled an economy that depended on openness. But the damage goes beyond money. Karelia's demographic decline has accelerated into something closer to an exodus. Young people, especially those with language skills and cross-border connections, are leaving. They are not waiting for recovery. They no longer believe it will come. What remains is an aging population and a shrinking workforce conditions that deepen dependence on the center while eroding local resilience. Cultural loss follows economic collapse. The Karelian identity, shaped over centuries at the intersection of Finnish and Russian worlds, is suffocating. Language programs fade without exchange. Cultural institutions lose partners. A heritage that survived wars and shifting borders now faces something quieter and more lethal isolation. Without access to resources and collaboration across the frontier, preservation becomes memory rather than practice. Families pay the highest price. The border closure has split households along citizenship lines. Grandparents and grandchildren live within driving distance yet remain unreachable. Funerals are missed. Milestones pass unseen. What once felt like an administrative inconvenience has become a permanent emotional wound. Official narratives in Moscow assign blame outward, portraying Finland as hostile and ungrateful. On the ground, many in Karelia see it differently. They understand cause and effect. They see how decisions made far away have turned their region into collateral damage. Resentment grows quietly, not as protest, but as disillusionment. Karelia now stands as a warning. Security policies crafted at the level of states reshape lives at the level of villages. When borders harden, cultures, thin economies contract, and trust evaporates. The region that once connected worlds is becoming a dead end, its future narrowed by forces it did not choose. As the land border hardens, the strategic struggle shifts to water. For Russia, the Baltic Sea was once an outlet, a maritime corridor linking St. Petersburg to Europe and the wider world. Today, it is increasingly perceived as a narrowing trap. With Finland and Sweden now inside NATO, the geography of the North has turned unforgiving. The Baltic is no longer a buffer, it is a basin surrounded by potential adversaries. The most sensitive point lies in the Gulf of Finland, a narrow stretch of sea bordered by Finland to the north and Estonia to the south. In places, the distance is short enough to be covered by modern coastal missile systems. In a crisis, this waterway could be closed within hours, effectively bottling up Russia's Baltic fleet. Warships designed for open maneuver would find themselves confined, exposed, and strategically irrelevant. For Moscow, this scenario is intolerable. Naval power is not just military capability, it is prestige. Losing freedom of movement in the Baltic would signal a broader loss of status. This is why Russian planners have been quietly advancing an alternative concept, one that avoids NATO-controlled waters altogether and turns inward. The focus is Lake Ladoga. Vast, deep, and entirely surrounded by Russian territory, the lake offers something the Baltic no longer does: sanctuary. Through inland waterways and canals, small missile-capable vessels can be transferred into this internal sea, transforming it into a concealed launch platform. These are not traditional warships. They are low-profile, fast, and equipped with long-range cruise missiles. From this position, the strategic equation changes. Targets across northern Europe fall within range, while access to the lake remains closed to NATO forces. Submarines cannot enter, surface ships cannot approach. Surveillance is limited by geography and air defense. What appears on maps as a civilian lake becomes in military terms a floating arsenal hidden behind forests and terrain. This strategy reflects adaptation under pressure. As the Baltic Sea becomes constrained, Russia compensates by weaponizing depth rather than access. It is a reminder that military innovation often emerges from disadvantage. However, it also signals a shift away from openness toward secrecy and denial, hallmarks of a defensive posture hardened by fear. The implications extend beyond Russia. Northern European capitals must now consider threats that do not originate from obvious fronts. Deterrence becomes more complex when strike platforms are concealed inland rather than deployed at sea. Transparency erodes. Miscalculation becomes easier. This hidden militarization underscores a larger pattern. As NATO tightens control over shared spaces, Russia retreats into its interior, turning geography itself into a weapon. The result is a security environment defined less by movement and more by concealment, a dangerous equilibrium where visibility decreases and suspicion fills the gaps. What has emerged along the Finnish-Russian border is more than a military standoff. It is a transformation in how security is defined and who pays for it. Walls rise, forces mobilize, deterrence is declared a success. Yet beneath these hardened postures, something fragile is breaking. For states, the logic is clear. Finland gains security by making aggression prohibitively costly. NATO gains depth and credibility. Russia, feeling encircled, seeks safety in fortification and concealment. Each move follows an internal rationale. Each is defensible within its own strategic language. But taken together, they form a cycle that feeds on fear rather than stability. The border now functions as a permanent emergency. It no longer breathes. It does not adapt. It simply divides. For the people living near it, freedom of movement has been replaced by permission. Economic choice has been replaced by survival. Cultural exchange has been replaced by suspicion. Security has increased, but at the cost of connection. This pattern is not unique to the North. In Ukraine, front lines freeze societies into long-term trauma. In the Middle East, fortified borders harden identities and prolong conflict. In the Pacific, strategic choke points shape rivalries between the United States and China. The Finnish border is part of a global trend power competing in narrow spaces where civilians live. Under President Donald Trump, Washington frames these developments as necessary adjustments in a dangerous world. Strength deters chaos. Alliances prevent war. Yet history suggests that prolonged militarization reshapes democracies as much as it deters adversaries. Emergency logic, once normalized, rarely retreats on its own. Europe now faces a quiet dilemma. Can it remain a continent defined by openness while normalizing sealed borders and total defense? Can security be maintained without turning entire regions into buffers stripped of economic and cultural life? Karelia's experience suggests the answer is not simple. As snow falls again along the northern frontier, the border stands firm, efficient, guarded, and unforgiving. It protects capitals, it reassures strategists, but it also traps communities in a future they did not choose. The final question lingers unresolved and uncomfortable in a world where security keeps expanding and freedom keeps contracting. Who decides when the balance has gone too far? The militarization of the Finnish-Russian border marks a decisive shift in Europe's security landscape. Finland's abandonment of neutrality and embrace of total defense reflects a broader loss of faith in stability without strength. Russia's response fortifications, revived districts, and hidden strike capabilities reveals a state adapting to shrinking strategic space through fear-driven measures. Between them lies Karelia, a region transformed from bridge to barrier, paying the human and cultural cost of geopolitical rivalry. This northern confrontation mirrors global trends where security imperatives dominate policy, often at the expense of civilian life and long-term trust. As borders harden and societies mobilize, the risk is not only military escalation, but the normalization of permanent emergency. Europe's challenge now is not merely to deter conflict, but to preserve the values that once made its borders worth crossing.